variables a little bit, um, because people were kind of losing an understanding of why, for instance, you would even have a parliament in Brittany that they'll have their own laws, they can do what they want, you know, and what we care about is, look, please give us your taxes.
Right,
Um,
right. Well,
yeah,
that's the shift. The shift
yes,
from being a country where the regions agree to trade and agree to worship the same head,
yeah,
right? And then so the previous tradition up until this point is you have a king, that king has a title, that title is relative to your land.
yeah,
The king doesn't have one title, the king has like 50 in
yeah,
some, right? So we looked at this once, the Holy Roman Empire and all the titles of the Holy Roman
yes,
Emperor. And it's
yeah,
like, wow. And see, this is going to be important later, right? But I think that the main problem is that, ironically, England and the United States, or what would become the United States, never lost the understanding of the difference between the divine power and power from below. And I don't think the Enlightenment people made that mistake either, although I could be wrong about that. But I don't think they were religious, like they
yes.
were. All right. Well, I am back with Adam, and today we're going to talk about sort of the French Revolution and Napoleon and the misapprehension of the Enlightenment. And basically, this stemmed from a conversation. I was trying to figure something out one day, and I went on BOM, and Adam was there, and I'm like, "Oh, Adam knows a bunch of this type of history that I don't know." And the original conversation was a bunch of people in the Bridges of Meaning Discord at the time, and it seemed like they enjoyed the show because most of them stayed for the duration. And we sort of went through these threads, and we did it in a very haphazard fashion, right? But it worked out. It worked out well. But I figured, like, oh, because it came up again the other day on Bridges of Meaning, I figured, like, well, let's do this again, because we can make a more coherent story out of it now that we're not sort of just we're out of discovery phase to some extent, because all the theses have been expounded upon once, and we'll probably discover new things. But yeah, this is another sort of amateur historian, different perspective kind of a podcast. So, what do you want to say as way of introduction, Adam?
Uh, just that we're going to be probably starting off with the American Revolution and going from there, the sort of basis of America, and then England, kind of, and how that begins with a sort of divide between that and the French Revolution. And we'll see where that goes, because that's a big divide that nobody really tends to look at nowadays.
Right, right. In the context of the larger war, right?
Yes.
Everybody in the U.S. goes, "Ooh, the revolution!" It's like, it's a tiny skirmish in this huge battle that's going
Yeah.
on, that's been going on, right, the whole time.
Mm.
So, yeah. All right. You wanna start us off?
Sure. Yeah. So where do we begin? Well, I guess big wars. What's going on, of course, at the time of just before the American Revolution is the 7 Years' War, which is quite a big conflict. I think if you look at it, Churchill talks about that being almost the First World War, just because the amount of powers that are involved, and the scale of the armies is increasing, which is something that you'll be seeing sort of throughout this time period. Is, you know, they're kind of the arms. People are tooling up, trying to beat their rivals. And you see as well at this time that there's also sort of a string of alliances. And but the point being is that you're getting armies of maybe 30,000, 40,000, whereas maybe 100 years or even 200 years prior you had maybe half that. They're still actually rather small. Like, you aren't. I mean, to put it in the context of our last conversation, that the Romans could field armies of about 40,000. So we're kind of getting back to sort of Roman period numbers of people fighting on the battlefield. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, France is central to this, obviously, because we're talking about the French Revolution. But it is a storied power in Europe at the time, and they're getting involved in a war. Now, the 7 Years' War is basically England and Prussia versus France, and I think Austria. Austria's on their side, I think, at that point as well. But that large war is basically a prelude, and the French during the course of that war, bankrupt themselves because they are trying to grapple with their main enemy being Great Britain, and that causes some problems. That causes instability within the French government, and then there's a sort of decline from, if you know, the Louis the 14th, the Sun King, right? That's the sort of peak of French power, the peak of the French monarchy, and it kind of goes down from there. And that's what is occurring at that time. Like you're seeing that turnover.
Right, right. And there's a space that's been opened up by the
Yeah.
success of the Americans, because
Yes.
a lot of people don't understand. There's a huge difference between the way that Europe thinks about power and control and government and how they think about it in England. And that's kind of a stepping stone to how we think about it in the United States. And the thing that opens up is you've got spies in England and you've got spies in France for years, decades, writing letters. Any day now, this is going to collapse and you'll be able to move your forces. Both sides are saying this at the
Yeah.
same time. Right? Any day, any day, and any day is not coming. I mean, it's not coming. It's not happening.
Yeah.
And they don't know why, right?
Yeah.
Because by the rules of continental style philosophy, that's a dumb experiment that has no hope. Like
Right.
there's no hope
Well,
over there for those idiots.
and that happens like after the American Revolutionary War, or that's how it's framed. The American Revolution, basically the American splitting from the Commonwealth from the United Kingdom, and that occurs as a result of a lot of the debts incurred. Actually, that's the story is, where do they get the taxes from? Why are the taxes being levied in the first place? Well, it's this idea that the crown was, well, it wasn't just the crown; it was the Parliament, really, basically saying, well, we had to fight, the French in the Americas. We had to put up the money and the men and the supplies, so it's only fair that the colonies pay. And then there's a bit of a disagreement there, but largely the disagreement in that context as well. Because the difference that I see from the American Revolution, or let's say the American the finding of independence, because revolution is a tentative framing. The Americans,
Right.
it strikes me, especially the Continental Congress, are not trying to overturn things. They are
Right.
essentially, many of them even would have spoken with English accents. They would have seen themselves as actually English aristocracy. And when they
Right.
were when they presented their petition to the king, they were making it as English subjects and as the rights that they had under the king. And they
Yes.
were saying
Yeah.
the king needs to respect these, or well, or else, and it's quite reasonable as well, because it's all escalation on the crown side in terms of trying to push them. And well, it's a sort of local elite saying, look, you need to respect who we are. We don't have representation in Westminster, which is a pretty important thing in the English tradition, at least post 1689, post the Glorious Revolution, because that's where you have Parliament essentially. This is kind of like the final victory of Cromwell. You have the Parliament basically telling the king what's going to happen, and so the king can't exactly. The idea is the king should be able to intercede for his subjects, but
Right.
in principle, what happens is you have this sort of parliamentary um, um, prominence, and
Right.
so even
Primacy.
yeah, I mean, and think about as well what's happening in the American Revolution at that time. Who is the king? It is one of the Georges. It is one of the Hanoverian imports. And the one thing that you realize if you look at the history of that period is that basically those guys were being told what to do by the parliament, by Parliament, because these were kings who, in some sense, are usurpers. Because how did they become kings? They become kings by the Parliament changing a law and saying only Protestants can inherit, and so they skip over 40 nearest relatives of the old Stuart kings. That's kind of background, but the point being is that there is a fundamental shift, and you have this Parliament which is kind of cut off from the colonies, and the colonies say, well, this isn't the what we agreed. This is where's the how can we redress our grievances? And of course, petitioning the king will only get you so far. You have to pass things through Parliament to actually get anything done. So,
Right. And they're
yeah,
not represented. And
Yes.
yeah, I think yeah, that's really good framing. Actually, I didn't think of it that way. So there's a political vacuum, right? The political
Yes.
power that should be located in the colonies is not there as a result of this change in England,
Yeah.
right? And so you notice there's a changing in England, and
Yes.
that's going to play into France, right? And then at the
Yeah.
same time, I think you're right. Like I didn't think about this. The American Revolution is not a revolution in any
Mm.
sense of the word. It just isn't, right? It started out that way maybe, but it didn't end that way. So you've got
Yeah.
an elite over here that is unable to be properly represented because they assume they'd be represented by their king. That's
Yes.
how it always worked before,
Right.
right? And then it's like, wait, that's not working. Like, what's going on? And then the king is not, and that's why they go after the king, right? Unfairly,
Yes.
for sure, unfairly for sure. But that's because he was the target because he was the guy who was supposed to represent them, and he
Mm.
failed to do so from their perspective. But also, there's another lesser known thing. So this tax thing is it's just a tax to pay for the war, but there's actually an economic factor there that a lot of people don't understand. So I forget the name of the book, and I have a book on this. It's absolutely brilliant. It talks about the roads in the United States and where they came from. So it was illegal to build a road, a public road in the colonies. It was
Oh
illegal.
my.
Could not do that. Right. And there was a reason for that. The reason why was because England had to control all the trade. That was the deal. You
Mm.
have to ship something to another colony. You have to use a ship. You can't own the ship as a colonist. You cannot own ships. You are not owning ships.
That's right.
All the ships are owned by British merchants. And so the Stamp Act affects all trade in the colonies that's not over badly rutted private roads. So the first, little known fact, the first corporation in the New World is the Massachusetts Turnpike. And it's a collection of people who get together and incorporate
Yeah.
to have their private lands with little turnpikes and tolls so that people can
Okay.
get from the eastern part of Massachusetts to the western part of Massachusetts, roughly. So, and I don't remember how far back it went, but the turnpike now goes all the way across. Like it's
Yeah.
going, it goes all the way across east to west, right? So that you've got the wealthy John Hancock, who's the wealthiest man in the colonies, right? And he's backing the revolution. Why? Because the glass ceiling. He can't make
Yeah.
any more money because he can't control any trade, right? So
Yeah.
there's all this. There's a political component. There's an economic component, and then
Right.
there's this freedom component where the freedom is being constrained by the Stamp Act because now people can't get the goods that they need because they can't afford them
Yeah.
because the Stamp Act has made things too expensive, roughly speaking. And so that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And people fail to see all this stuff going on. And again, at the same time, something changed in England. We're not
Yes.
sure what. So something changes in England, and that change in England causes a change in the colonies where they're not so much revolting, but they're reforming a government from scratch effectively.
Yeah.
But it is the elites that are doing it too. It's not that it's being done by a bunch of rabble farmers in the
Mm.
farmland. To your point, they saw themselves as part of the aristocracy because, well, they were part of the aristocracy, or at least they were supposed to be well represented by the aristocracy. And they had lost representation due to this change, this mysterious, I would say, change in England that was unexpected, right? It was out of the blue. No one saw any of this coming ahead of time.
Well, I think you could see it in the beheading of the king. They beheaded King Charles I in 1649, and that was the mistake that kicks off this idea of importing a king and all of that. There is a sort of intermittent episode there, but the long and short of it is, and you could see how that would affect it though. Beheading the king, basically getting into their own revolution. Like for a period of time, England is a republic that has no king. And so this, of course, knocks out. The founding fathers of America are living in that post Glorious Revolution world, post English Civil War world, and so they're looking at it through that lens. But I think what you see with the American Revolution is that there are local problems that need to be dealt with, and the people who are supposed to deal with them in the Parliament are not do not have the eyes to see what's actually happening there and can't address them directly. And so naturally, then you have essentially a redress of rights that they already that many of the colonists knew they already had because being subjects of the king. That is, That is that there was an agreement made, and it wasn't being kept to. Um, See, and where this changes in somewhere like France, of course, is of course one thing you know about the American Revolution is somebody like the Marquis de Lafayette. He's a French aristocrat, um, and he goes and helps out the revolutionaries. And of course, much of the American, let's say, rebellion, for lack of a better term, because revolution really is let's say revolution, but um, much of the American Revolution is funded by France.
Right,
And
right. That starts tax problem number two. Right.
yes,
So this tax problem in England that causes America while England's changing. Then there's
yeah,
tax problem number two in the tax money going to the right that causes the cost of basically all that happens in France. The cost of bread goes up so high that no one can afford bread anymore, literally,
yeah.
and that's their staple food. And it's like, whoa! And it was their staple food. Interestingly, back to Roman times. I don't know if you know about the four-wheeled
Oh yes.
multi-staged bread factory that they found that the Romans put in France. So
Oh
France
really?
had,
Cool.
yeah, it was a
Nice.
huge factory to mill grain, huge
Yeah.
in France, and it's the only one they know of that size. So
France is perfect
France,
for it though, with its land.
yes, with the land and with the water, it just had this perfect. So there's this like four-stage water wheel thing that was way earlier than anybody expected,
Wow.
right? And so they've got this history of grain production and grain overproduction, really, right? They're
Yeah.
overproducing bread. So bread is their staple food, much like rice is the staple food in China, right? It's the same sort of thing. And so the taxes play an issue in all of this, right? And because taxes are oppression and taxes are part of the economic ceiling problem, and right, they're all tied together. Back then, we have
Yeah.
no concept of this now because tax rates are so much lower. Actually, right, we're much more free by economically free by taxes than we ever were. That's why the Europeans tend to complain less, even though their tax rates are exorbitant
Higher.
to us in the U.S.
Yeah. But one thing to look at with the French scenario is we've gone over two instances of massively incurring debt. It's the 7 Years' War, right? Which the French largely do, like I believe they sort of lose in the overall goals that they're looking for. So they sink loads of money into that. So they lose one war, and then mere a decade or two later, they're sinking loads more into funding this strange thing happening in the English colonies. That they'd like to profit off of, right? Which goes back to the idea of the spies, right? That this was sort of a kind of a proxy war to keep the English busy.
Well, they're still fighting. They're still fighting. They
Yeah.
still want that property, right? And the
Yeah.
first way they tried to get the property was by ginning up the Native Americans against the colonists, and that was a
Yes.
proxy. So they're using the Indians. A lot of people don't understand this. They use the Native Americans in Canada and in the United States to attack England. And they
Yeah.
did that either by having the Indians directly attack the colonists because they were English, like at the time, right?
Yeah.
Or by getting a war going to distract England, so they'd have to send in troops. And again,
Yeah.
that goes back to the tag. They have to send in troops for the Indian Wars. They have to do it, and so
Yeah.
now they want that money back, even though it was long since spent, and they were they were citizens. They didn't.
Yeah.
They're like, no, no, no. We're serving in the army for you. We're serving in the navy for you over here in the colonies. Why are you treating us differently from the people who live across the pond, right?
Yeah.
And that was really, and that came up again in the War of 1812, which is a different mess. But yeah,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's the consummation of the Anglo-American split, let's say. um, but yeah, I think there's something to be said as well as what's going on in the sort of circles of thought, both in France and in England at the time, because this idea of an English Republic, which we touched on, happened. This is under the time of Cromwell. That is, to give perspective, that's in the mid 1600s, so about 1650, and for about, I think, almost 10 years, 8 years is that English Republic. Um, and a lot of that has roots in let's say the Reformation and the impact that had on the British Isles. But more importantly, is you have this sort of gathering tide of the Enlightenment. So you have David Hume is in the basically throughout all the early 1700s up until about 1760, I think 1770. So he's just before I think he dies probably roughly around that time, anyways. And then you have a new sort of um, class of thinker occurring on the continent in France, because of the sort of fall of the power of France, let's say, right? Its ability to project its power, or not project its power, but to gain territory and to show that it can. It's a country that's not to be trifled with.
Loses its force on
Yeah,
the globe.
yeah, and as a result, you have these sorts of strange ideas coming in from people like Voltaire and um, Rousseau. Now, Voltaire is actually he gets a lot of his. No, it was not Voltaire. It was Montesquieu. That's Montesquieu. So in America, you have this idea of separation of powers, and that comes from Montesquieu's attempt to um, uh, understand the English system, basically. But he is primarily a philosopher in France. He's around the time of Louis XIV. So around 17, let's say we're in 1780, which is around the time of the Revolution, right? Rousseau has had a massive impact because he has this idea of a social contract and all of this sort of thing. It's quite strange for the time, but a lot of the nobility in France are taken by it, because they've only recently, many of them are absentee. They don't stick to their lands. It's only the rather poor nobility that actually are living among their own people. This happened 50 years prior. Is that you have this Louis XIV bringing all of the nobility in. This, you have the idea of the court life, Versailles, all of that, right? But those sorts of ideas are gaining sway, and you see that there's kind of a political slowing down of the political machine in France. Now at this time, it should be said that France is still, you have a direct line from Louis XVI, who's the last French king before he loses his head. You have a direct line from this man all the way back to, roughly speaking, Charlemagne. It's not a direct line patrilineally, but it's close enough, right? You have different dynasties coming through, and so you have this sort of continuous idea of France being one of the major kingdoms of Europe. In fact, the Pope would have given titles to each of the major kings of Western Europe. So the Spanish king was called His Most Catholic Majesty. I think the English king was called, oh, I can't remember, but it would have been His Most Ex Majesty. And then the France, I can't remember quite. I'll have to look it up. But the point being is that France is sort of playing a part in this great sort of, let's say, Western European dance of monarchs. But what's happening here is that it's lost a lot of its momentum, and now the nobility France is quite unique in standing out at the rest of Europe at this time as well, because you have this weird court life. We have all the nobility, the dukes, the counts, who can afford to get there, come to Paris, just in Versailles, which is just outside Paris, and sort of wait upon the king. But with this loss, you have sort of, people are searching, and they're listening to these philosophers. Many of these philosophers are these same nobles, and they're saying, well, we're hearing these things about the colonies, right? They're sort of removing the head. They're getting rid of the king, right? Why shouldn't we do the same thing? Right. And they're also, and many of them as well, as I was saying with Montesquieu, are looking to England as well and seeing what's happening there. And of course, people look at the French Revolution and think, oh, the French taking the head of their king. The English did it first. The English took the head of their own king first, and that was what the French were looking to.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's probably worth interjecting here just quickly. This is super important. Like, there is a replacement of the head, symbolically and literally in this case. There's a replacement of the head, and there's an attempt to understand how England survived that. And then there's this attempt to understand how the colonies, right? Because there's a lot of sympathy. Because I think that there's a lot of sympathy in France for the plight of the colonists on the basis that they're elite. The elite are, right. And so it's not just like the common people are going, oh, there's common people that are poor. Like, that's not happening at all. Like, nobody knows, nobody cares, right? But what is happening is the elite are going, hey, and they're a rising power throughout Europe. But now you have to bring in the continental idea of continental philosophy and the break that happened, because that's like continental philosophy to this day. Still, you talk to Europeans, you talk to people in the United States, you talk to people in England, you're going to get three different takes on how the world works. And the continental take is power is bestowed from above. Your rights are given to you from the divine through the divine right of kingship. That's how it works. And so your rights are enumerated for you by the king, roughly speaking. Now, Parliament's there to help implement, sure, right? And that's the original conception. But now all that is broken, right? England goes, wait a minute. No. The people just living their lives, just by virtue of having been born on the Isle, right? In the Grand England, they have rights. Like they're already there. They're already bestowed upon them by virtue of their birth. This is a totally different way to think. And it's radical. It's completely radical. And it's so radical, actually, that to this day, I mean this literally, the Continentals do not understand this. They do not. Continentals who spent years in the United States, totally blown away by how our court systems work. They don't understand it. They have no idea how it functions, literally. And I've talked to many of them. It's just fast. I'm like, how this is the easiest thing in the world. How come you don't get it, right? But and even I forget where I was hearing this. So the difference between the change in law, right? Because there's common law and there's civil law, and there's a lot of people. Oh, I know, it was a Jordan Peterson talk with the woman from Africa. And she basically goes to the African governments and says, hey, have you heard of common law? And they go, what? No, there's only civil law. It's like, no, there's this whole tradition of common law that's hundreds of years old at this point. And they're like clueless. So there are people in the world who don't understand civil law and common law are different. You can mix and match maybe, but if you don't have a sense for common law, you're missing a now, storied and historied way of executing law. And I mean, if even one country on the African continent, and it seemed to be many from the discussion I heard, has that problem that they're not aware that there's another way of implementing law. That's kind of a big deal. So you have that same problem in the continent, right, where they really don't understand England. Europe doesn't understand England, and this is early days. So now nobody understands it just because there's been a change and everyone's struggling to understand it. So I think part of the Enlightenment is struggling to understand how top-down power from above, roughly speaking, broke. Like, how is this working? Because we beheaded the king, and yet we're still a country and everything still works. And we thought we knew how that worked. And now we need new theories, right? And new ways of understanding. And then of course, the change in England, there's a bigger change, right? We take one more step in the colonies, right? The United States actually fulfills sort of the ideal postulated by the Enlightenment thinkers, I think is the best way to think about it.
I think it should be said, though, that what's happening. So this idea that of continental philosophy really only congeals around the French Revolution. I would say actually it's kind of a focusing point or a narrowing point, because of course even in France at this time you have local parliaments. Now of course you could say, well, they don't function in exactly the way that the English Parliament would at the same time, but the English Parliament only functions as it does because of this idea of beheading the king and sort of this whole episode, right? So but before then, the Parliament, the English Parliament and the French parliaments, right? They all worked in the same way, which was that they were there to help the king to govern, right? And I think what happens, and of course in France, as you would see in Spain and Portugal, is you would have these local parliaments or councils, basically, which are there to. So in France you'll have, and France is very, very different. You have very different people, right? You have the Bretons, you have the Parisians, sort of that sort of section. You have the people who speak Occitan, so the ones closer to the Mediterranean. You've sort of the Basques in the very far south, and you've very different people groups kind of in France, and so you need to have that sort of representation, or you need to have that sort of resolution in your governments, or in your government of France. Same for all of Europe. The difference comes is, of course, by the time you get to the other side of the French Revolution, all of that is gone. And of course, what happens then is that spreads. It's because you have this idea, of course, around the Enlightenment of this rationality, and so you need to rationalize the government, right? You can't have. Why should we have this sort of Breton parliament that's full of these provincial type people? If we can't sort of use the same system for the entirety of the country, even though these are ancient institutions, many of them, the Parliament in Paris is as old as 1200. It was set up by King Saint Louis the Ninth. He was a crusader, right? And so, but and many of them, even so if you look at the English Parliament, you could say that has a has at this point 1,000-year-old tradition, right?
Wow.
And so it's the same for all these regional parliaments. But what happens is that they're squashed because there's a sort of coalescing around, well, we can just make it more efficient. We can just make government more efficient, and we can kind of play with the variables a little bit, because people were kind of losing an understanding of why, for instance, you would even have a parliament in Brittany that they'll have their own laws. They can do what they want, and what we care about is, look, please give us your taxes.
Right. Right. Well,
Yeah.
that's the shift. The shift
Yes.
from being a country where the regions agree to trade and agree to worship the same head.
Yeah.
Right. And then so the previous tradition up until this point is you have a king. That king has a title. That title is relative to your land.
Yeah.
The king doesn't have one title. The king has like 50 in
Yeah.
some, right? So we looked at this once, the Holy Roman Empire and all the titles of the Holy Roman
Yes.
Emperor. And it's
Yeah.
like, wow. And see, this is going to be important later, right? But I think the main problem is that, ironically, England and the United States, or what would become the United States, never lost the understanding of the difference between the divine power and power from below. And I don't think the Enlightenment people made that mistake either, although I could be wrong about that. But I don't think they were religious. Like they
Yes.
were embedded
Oh, yes.
totally embedded in religion. And so when they talk about their stuff, they're talking about it embedded in religion, right? They're not Kantian.
Yes.
They're not Immanuel Kant. Oh, do away with all that religion stuff, right? Well, we'll push the boundaries. We'll make philosophy come more this way. It's like they weren't like that. They were like, no, we have this. This is good. We're not going to change it, but we are going to add self-determination. But self-determination means something very, very different when you're embedded in a religious tradition, right? Say from the Bible, as they were, right? In a Christian tradition, versus when that's not there to constrain you, right? Now, self-determination means, well, I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, wherever I want, because it doesn't matter, right? There's nothing constraining me. So it doesn't make any difference, right? And that's obviously that's going to become relevant later. But here are some of the seeds of that of that problem. So the Enlightenment thinkers didn't have this problem because they were embedded in the religion.
Yes,
and they hadn't unyoked, right? That was later. That was Immanuel Kant and a bunch, Rousseau and a bunch of other people started that. So on the continent they did. So even though they were more Catholic in France in particular, right? They were more there was a lot of people attending church, right? They were more embedded. They adopted these ideas as part of this efficiency claim, right? And precision, that's going to come up later, right? And tried to flatten things and make things not just about the taxes anymore, right? But make something larger and more universal, say within the boundaries of their country, which, how many republics are we on according to you? 5?
5. We're on Republic number 5. I think Empire number 2. I don't know if we're going to get a third,
So that's since the French Revolution.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's all important context. Like that there is a way in which there's a misreading of what the Enlightenment folks were talking about because it's taken out of the context of the embedded religion. And that's what ironically causes, it's kind of like they start pointing upward and then the head vanishes.
Yes.
It just vanishes, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in the United States, they never pointed upward. That
Mm.
never happened. We just kind of like, oh, we're all Protestants here. It's all good. And none of the Protestants talked about it. They just kind of religious freedom, and that's it. They just
Yeah.
never went any further than that partly because they didn't have a unified version of Christianity. So they never talked about it. It just
Well,
wasn't discussed.
well, as far as I'm aware, what happened in the early stages of the American Republic was that each state could basically have its own established religion. So the
Mhm.
Puritans can have their Puritan colony, and the Catholics can have their colony, which I believe was Maryland.
Maryland.
Uh,
Yep.
yeah. Um, so you had all of that. So it wasn't. It was kind of like you could gather these people who are all pointing up, to their let's say denomination, and then they could all gather around and say, well, we're gonna, we'll defend each other or something like that, right? Um,
Right. Right. Well, and it didn't start like that because Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island, which is a tiny state,
yeah,
he got kicked out of Massachusetts. And
yeah,
they let him in. They're like, yeah, we know you have a different way of viewing the world, but we'll let you in. And then he was like, oh, screw that. I'm going to go form my own
that's right,
colony, basically, and
that's
which
right,
eventually became a state, right? So
yeah,
it's not like it was designed that way from, we'll say, day one, but yeah, there is very much, and the founding fathers said this, like this explicitly, this experiment doesn't work without God. They said that.
yes,
It's
oh yeah,
really important to realize that
yeah,
we never lost that sense, like, or at least in the beginning, we never lost that sense that we're embedded in these principles coming from a book. And it's roughly the same book. There's a little bit of difference in translation. There's a
yeah,
lot of difference in interpretation, right? State by
yeah,
state, as it turned out. But, basically, you get the gist. And the gist is roughly the same for everybody.
yeah. That is something that I didn't come to my mind immediately. But that's right. Is the Sam Adams, one of the founding fathers, basically said this whole thing can only work, for people who are uh, brought up, according to proper morality, which biblical morality, right, and that can govern themselves. Let's say because they were coming from a more natural view of freedom, which is that a man has as many masters as he has vices, and so if you want to have everyone governing the whole country, you need to have people who are actually willing to govern themselves and what their behavior and what they do. Um, that's right. And the thing is with what happens in the French Revolution, by the end of it, so by the end of it, you have, along with flipping everything over on its head, you have this abandonment of God. You have this abandonment of the God of Abraham and Isaac. You have. I mean, I think it would probably be good to look at that religious upheaval, because what happens when the French Revolution starts off? Well, the way it starts off initially is just nobles coming along, and the king summoning the Estates General, and roughly speaking, they're kind of on the track of England up until a point, right, which is a constitutional monarchy. The monarch will be sitting sort of kind of aside, and the Parliament will be kind of deciding it. The problem is, of course, is that a lot of the people who are going in for this um, Parliament, this council, this National Assembly, I believe it was called, they were so sort of caught up in the revolutionary fervor, because a lot of things, all of a sudden, they were allowed to change a lot of things which previously were only within the remit of the king. Um, and so, what do they do with that? Is they say, well, none of us can stand for the next election, right? So all the original people who, and at this point you had a sort of divide between the people who were for the rights of the king and people who wanted to sort of, Lafayette, I believe, was more on the side of the people who wanted to sort of push things. Let's try and get a constitution going or something like that, right? Um, but then they say, you know what? No, none of us are allowed to stand for the next election. And so what happens is essentially they allow like radicals in. They all say, no, we're so good, we're not going to stand for the next one. So they sort of abdicate leadership, and the king can't do anything because he's not in a position to lead exactly. He's trying to get out of there most of the time, to his cousins or his monarchical relations elsewhere. Um, And so that's kind of where it kind of breaks off, and it just gets more radical and more radical. That's how you get to the guillotines, and that's how you eventually end up beheading the king. Is that um well, you have the way this ends up once these guys sort of basically select themselves out, once they take their hands off the wheel, these nobles and aristocrats, and some of them from the merchant classes as well, to be sure. um they they end up erecting a temple to the goddess Reason in the middle of Paris. I think
Right.
over an old cathedral, and as well, what's happening as well at this time. Um, Once you get past this sort of initial stage of moderate sort of let's basically follow this track that England's gone, they kind of run off the beaten track, and you have like cathedrals and churches being sort of um, burned in Paris. Now, this is all happening in Paris as well. It should be noted this is a very local phenomenon to Paris. Why? Because the king has brought all the nobility into Paris, and so you have all of this crazy stuff happening in Paris. And it should be noted that much of the early stages, right, even I believe to the point of where they, when they behead the king, if you were out in the countryside in France, it's nothing much has changed.
No idea. You probably
No
don't
idea.
know what's happening at
No,
all.
no. Um,
Communication is slow,
yeah,
right? And look, I mean, all of this is a misread of the quote revolution in the United States, right? Because
they were trying to copy the Americans, right?
right, they're trying to copy the American, but they're not, right? Because they, and they're casting it very much as, well, look at these reasonable people who, sort of were given power, or took power on their own as the merchant class, which, is somewhat of a true story, but they weren't entirely merchant class because they came from the aristocracy to begin with. So it's not like those families didn't have a history. It's not like they weren't trained elites. They were well read, right? This is happening with one of the many revivals of the Greek and Latin texts where it's been rediscovered, right? And so all the founding fathers read that stuff, right? And at the same time, to your point, Hume's coming along, and all this other stuff.
Yeah,
And there's a philosophical battle between the Rousseaus and Voltaires of the world, right? And what's going on roughly in Scotland, not really England,
yeah,
but we'll just set that aside because England's so well, right. So yeah, there's this philosophical switch going on, and then they're casting this not as an elite rising up to take their proper role, which is very much one interesting way to view the American Revolution, but they're casting this as a whole new way of governing,
yeah,
from below instead of from above. It's like, well, look, they did it over there, but the problem is you have drivers like Robespierre was snubbed by the king when he was young, or at
mm,
least he felt so, right? He had to give up. He won a contest, and he got to give the king a speech, and I think the king wasn't feeling well, so he shows up in this, whatever it is that they pull along, where people just
oh
waddle him
yes, yeah,
along,
yeah, yeah,
right? And he's looking from that, right? He's looking from a carriage, basically, and then he moves on, and Robespierre has no time with him, and he feels snubbed by that, and
yeah,
so there's some psychological stuff going on in the background, and I don't think he's the only noble that had that experience with an indifferent king and feeling like that was unjust, even though they were part of the sort of the tradition of the elite, right? It's not like these were nobody's peasants. They were already sort of in the middle of the hierarchy, and they're just pissed off that they're not, being given the proper due from the head, in this case, the king. And so that's for me, that's also sort of interesting framing to think about, because there is this streak, and then it's like, well, we're the elite, we're too good to rule, right? We don't,
mm,
when in fact they just didn't want the mass. They were like, well, we could give ourselves these powers, but then we'd have to do a lot of work, and
yeah,
we're the French elite. We're really not used to that at the end of the day. So what did that mean? No, I want to frolic around and do what I've been doing, and slough it off all onto the king. But then if we take the king out of the picture, then we have to do work, and there's all kinds of little factors coming in. But there's that misreading and the misuse of the Enlightenment to your point, like, oh no, we're gonna worship God anymore, like they do in those silly colonies. We're gonna worship reason, like right in the center of Paris. And yeah,
Yeah.
nobody in the country knows what's going on except the people directly involved in Paris.
Yeah. And the worst part about it is it spills out from Paris. Eventually, you have the guillotine. They cut off the head of the king, and it's a rather sad scene. What happens, of course, is because I mean Louis basically before he dies says, uh, um, I'm sorry for all the bad I did, even though I die innocent." Like he says, "I'm innocent, right? But I'm sorry for all the turmoil I may have caused. I forgive everyone who's offended against me, and that's pretty much it." The priest that he had with him was like when they were trying to restrain him before putting him on the gallows. He was resisting, and the priest, his confessor he had there, said to him, "Remember that our Savior died without resisting being bound." And then that was that. And then he was taken off, head chopped off, and that was that. And of course, at that point, it is really the turnover into the reign of terror, the killing of hundreds of thousands of people on the suspicion that they are counter-revolutionaries. It should be noted as well that something happens here in the spill out from Paris. Um, the Vendée was a region in the south near Nantes, so on the west coast of France, and that's a sort of rather poorer region. So a lot of the nobility, a lot of the aristocrats still live there. Um, among their people, they were the local lords, and so they would, they'd live among them or whatever. And when a lot of this news reaches them from Paris, well, people kind of go on about their daily business, but there comes a point where one thing happens, which is quite significant. When you get into this sort of sliding to getting from extreme to extreme, and you're implementing all of these crazy ideas, is this idea of the levée en masse, which is taking soldiers, right, and basically conscription in the earliest sense, right? Not like impressment, not like, oh, here's a guy who seems particularly strong, let's bag him and take us with us. It's more like, here's your piece of, it's more like what we're familiar with in the sort of world wars, which is, here's your piece of paper. You have been chosen, and we're going to take you, whether you like it or not. And that's, there's, if you resist, we will kill you. And that's what happened. And of course, the peasantry of this poor region in the Vendée don't want to send their sons off to die in these far off wars, which are happening at the time, of course, because once news of this reaches the other surrounding kingdoms, it's like, something's going on here. Let's get in on it, right? A lot of them were fighting for the king because many of them realized what was going on in Paris was not something that anyone wanted to, you know, leak out. But these peasants in the Vendée went up to their local lords and their manors, right, and demanded that the lords lead them, right, as a levy, against these revolutionaries from Paris. And what happens is the revolutionary government sends out these what were called the infernal columns, right, or the columns of hell. And what they did is they essentially went around and for a while these armies led by the lords, the local lords, did all right. But eventually you have, these well-armed men, probably armed from the foundries that are near Paris, that can pump out arms like nobody's business. Everyone, just, hey, here's a musket, here's some gunpowder, and here's some shot. And so eventually they lose. But what happens is, I mean, massacres that you would only really see that sound like they come from the 20th century, right? So you have the drowning of pregnant women in the river that Nantes is on. I can't remember, the Loire River, I believe. Um, but you drowning of all of these peasants who just were either bystanders or they were part of the army, and um, and that's kind of how the revolutionaries kind of strong armed those who would resist. And most of these peasants, by the way, in contrast to many of the revolutionaries who are busy worshiping the goddess reason in Paris, these are staunch Catholics. In fact, their emblem is first and foremost the flag they wave is the king's banner, and then they call themselves the Royal Army, and they have on their breast Sacred Heart of Christ, so the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and that's their sort of, and it's something like, I don't remember the exact phrase. It's something like, for God, King, and country, you know, more
Yeah.
more more like for God and for the King, um, and they get rightly slaughtered, by the Parisians, basically, who come in and just wipe the floor with them. But that was always a problem region. So and it is important to frame that, because what's happening in Paris isn't reflective of the rest of France as such, in terms of those local regions. Um, but it is indicative that the armies are getting bigger, right? You have these crazy new ideas that are coming out. What's also funny is they erect a temple of in Paris to the goddess Reason. They also change the structure. This is where we get the idea of year zero, right? It's the 10-day week. That's so they even changed the calendar, right? Actually, it's funny because of this revolutionary government, you have the reorganization of the ancient regions of France. So now if you look at a map of France, you have the departments, right, is what they're called, but they are not historical regions. They're named after historical regions, but they purposefully went out of their way to draw outside, like to just clump bits together to make it, I guess, more rational, right? Um, and so you have this large scale upturning of the previous order that's happening, and it's frightening most of Europe, really, quite frankly, especially with the fact that when you implement the levée en masse, the French army doubles in size within a year. And
Wow.
this is where you're sort of getting into the territory of hundreds of thousands of men on the battlefield, which you'd see in the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also worth pointing out, and I know you turned me on to Dan Carlin Hardcore History episode on painfotainment,
Mm.
which is very good, although very hard to listen to. So there's a huge change in the utility and the purpose of these mass killings. Like, first of
Yeah,
all, there weren't mass killings. There were hangings, and the bodies would stay up for days, if not longer. And there
yeah,
weren't just hangings. There was breaking on the wheel, and there were stocks, and there were all kinds of methods of public punishment that were designed to keep people in line and also to keep people aimed at the highest. And there was this whole sense he went into in cooperation. And then you have that replaced by the guillotine. And it's like, the problem with the guillotine is that it's efficient. And that's actually a problem,
mm.
right? Because now, first of all, you can kill hundreds or thousands of people in a very short amount of time. Whereas before, you got to build the gallows, you gotta tie the rope, and you gotta have a procession to go get the person, and you gotta bring them, and yeah, there's all this crazy stuff that you had to do. There was a ritual involved in these things, and you had to have a priest, and there was a confession, right? And so you have bits of that in some of this, but by and large, it becomes a machine, a literal machine.
Yeah,
And then, if you want to get into egregore or the spirit of the time, right, there's something moving all of this.
mm.
And is that the resentment of Robespierre? Is that a resentment of the nobles in general? Is that their willingness to overturn the order, the natural established order over hundreds of years, without wanting to take the responsibility for actually managing it and running it? Like, there's lots of likely candidates, and probably pieces of all of them
Yeah,
involved in that. But you can see the idea of efficiency, the idea of precision and accuracy. Like, oh, we're going to kill them quickly. We're not going to,
yeah,
and Dan Carlin does a brilliant job in that painfotainment episode of going into why that's a significant change, and what this capital punishment meant back in the day, and the fact that it did change, and that the change is really important and significant,
yeah,
and that it changes the society, or it represents such a change in the society, one of the two.
yeah. Well, and the thing is, right, the guillotine was made by physicians at the time exactly because it was to be efficient with the killing, right? So it's just, you're going to separate the
Right.
head from the body, and that will be that. Um, I mean, there is a bit of symbolism happening there as well, of course, right? Yeah. Um, it should be noted, yeah, I think the terror of Robespierre is really kind of linked to the guillotine. As a form of killing, it was, yeah, it wasn't like hanging, right? Because hanging takes space, and you need multiple people on the gallows, and you need to measure out the rope to make sure that they die. It can be quite messy. But the guillotine is, we know that once we put you under here and we pull that rope, or whatever the switch might have been, you're dead on the other side. And to the point of this efficiency and accuracy, that permeated pretty much everything, and was kind of, you know, in relation to this sort of losing of a head. In all of this chaos, you have one figure sort of emerging over it all, eventually, which is Napoleon. And Napoleon is a minor noble from Corsica. Um, so he's not exactly French. He's
No, he's not French. Yeah,
and
France took over Corsica when, like, right before he was born or right after he was born, and
yes,
he's born into Corsican nobility.
yes, his
And
father's name is Carlo Buonaparte.
right, well, and it's important to know, like, his family lost their prestige and their fortune when
Yeah,
France took over. Even though they kept him, I think, as a diplomat or something for a while, they kept his father as a diplomat. And
right.
then he was forced in Corsica, in the Corsican schools, to learn French.
Yes.
And so there's something going on there too. It's worth, yeah, it's worth noting that.
Yeah. And Napoleon comes from this lowly kind of dispossessed family, slightly dispossessed. I mean, he's still nobility, he still gets a good education, but right, he has to learn French in school. And he moves to, during all of this, he moves to Paris. He joins the army, actually, and joins, it's interesting to note what he joins as. He joins as an artillery officer. Now, just to the point, artillery, we think of this, especially the Napoleonic Wars, as sort of defined by artillery. All of a sudden, or rather, cannons feature prominently around this time. But cannons haven't really featured as heavily up until this point. And the reason why is largely metallurgical, and sort of, it costs a lot of resources to cast a cannon, and you need foundries. And of course, what's happening at this time is the Industrial Revolution. So you're having this increased capacity to mold steel and to make it higher quality as well. So in 1700, you had cannons, but they were very few and far between, and they weren't very accurate as well. The only time you'd really be using cannons is in a siege, right?
Right. They're siege engines, right? They have
Yeah,
nothing to do with normal battle, right? Up
yeah,
until this point.
yeah, and it's very rare. I don't know of any account, bar one in Alexander's case, but Alexander is sort of the edge case because he just does everything next, to the next level. And but the idea of using siege engines as sort of field artillery, right? The idea that we can somehow accurately hit the enemy, right? Which, I tell you what, Alexander wasn't hitting anyone accurately. He was just like, just throw it up and shoot it at them, right? Um, you know, that just wasn't the case. Even with muskets, it should be noted as well. Even, in the 16 and early 1700s, muskets were not very accurate. That's why they have this volley fire tactic. But on their own, they really aren't a great weapon to shoot with. It would only come later on that you sort of get this higher accuracy. And so when you were on the battlefield, it was reasonably, you had a reasonable chance of surviving. Especially in the 1600s. In fact, even in the mid to late 1600s, you had, pardon me, the early to mid, you had men still in full plate armor. Even in the English Civil War, you had men with breastplates. This is where you had and they'd be thicker, right? But they'd be shaped in such a way to make the bullets bounce off. But you still had this sort of idea of, like, for instance, the musket kind of replacing the bow, and the bow, again, you can be accurate with the bow, but it is mostly volley fire. You want to hit an area kind of broadly and say, yeah, roughly there. And cannons were the same sort of thing, actually. Well, if they were going to use them at all, it would be using like that, and they wouldn't be very good because you only had a solid projectile. So they were mostly used in sieges. But what happens around the time of Napoleon is you have this massive increase in the strength of the steel that's being used, or what the material is being used. I don't know if it was bronze or whatnot, but it would have been steel, I think, iron. Um, you have the strength of the material, and then you have the increased capacity to produce it, right? Um, and if you think about what's happening as well at the time, you think about this is also just after the time of Newton. So you have this sort of classical physics. You have this sort of give me give me the variables at this particular point, right? If I'm throwing a ball, right? Give me the variables at this particular point, and I'll be able to tell you where it lands exactly, precisely. Um, and what you're seeing at that point is well, a cannonball is just like a normal ball. Well, why don't we use this crazy new calculus that Newton's talking about and all of that? And that this is the world that Napoleon's walking into. And so he's seeing you get this massive increase in the accuracy of the cannons, because of the better metallurgy, and also later on you'll get rifling, um, and you're getting a lot more of them. He proves himself in the siege of Boulogne, and that's a siege, but he actually uses the cannons to hit the British Navy in the bay. But that's how Napoleon proves himself. And it's a little wonder that Napoleon is the one who actually starts to increase. It's Napoleon who starts to increase the use of cannons. So he uses all of these new technologies, um, and really is the first one to use cannons not as field artillery, but as or not as siege equipment, but as field artillery, and accurate field artillery as well.
Right. So the idea of precision artillery becomes a magic science to win wars. And
Yeah,
Napoleon is the one that makes this happen, right? Because he sees this connection between, oh, I've got a lot of these, they're getting fairly accurate, the range is increased, and I can use this crazy Newton stuff, whoever that guy is, and actually use them in new ways that people haven't thought of, to go after ships, right, to take down walls more efficiently, and also to knock down troops
yeah,
in a way that no one's ever seen. And so, it's a bit like bringing an elephant onto the Roman battlefield back in the day, right?
yeah,
It's like, whoa, what is this thing? We didn't see this coming. And you got to remember, battles are still line after line, right? So that's, they're still lining up and just throwing bodies at each other.
yeah,
But the cannon changes all that, because now you're lining up and someone's firing a cannon when you can't fire a shot, and then all of a sudden a bunch of your guys fall. It's like, whoa. So
yeah,
now you have this imbalance. And this is part of the genius of Napoleon, right? The reason why people follow him. It's not random. If you start
yeah,
at the beginning, it's like, oh, he's able to take a very small force of people and just wipe out a much larger force pretty reliably by this point, pretty reliably.
yeah. He was mostly that's the funny thing about the levée en masse, is that it increased France's military capacity, so that you're dealing with 50,000 men as sort of standard. But Napoleon was always outnumbered, because or mostly always outnumbered, especially at the beginning. So he would have this idea of defeat in detail. So it would be, you've got 5,000 men, you split off a few, a group of 1,000 and a group of 1,000. So you've got 3,000 left over as a core fist. These guys sort of will hold, 60% of the enemy army in place, and you take your guys here, you smash the smaller part, which you'll be bigger than. It is, and just back to the artillery, like this is the people look at World War One and it's like, oh, look at all the artillery pieces going off. Then you look at World War Two and you see the bombardiers. That is all in the same tradition, or even the same sort of route at Napoleon, because even in the mid 1800s you had this idea of a gunnery school. A gunnery school. You go to school to be a gunner, i.e., a gunner, like to command an artillery piece. You had a whole group of people who one would be doing the calculations to say we want to hit, let's say, there, and it's like, okay, well, you'll have your sort of way to get your elevation, and you'll have a rough distance of where that is, and then you just basically you'll have like a table, and you'll just read off the table, and it's like, okay, this is punch in the numbers for the cannon here, so it's um uh what's it, tilt it back this many degrees, and to the side, and all of that. And so it becomes
And use
basically like
this
a
much
fine,
powder,
yeah,
right?
use, yeah, exactly, this weight of powder. And it's all like it's it's exactly how you do the calculations in Newton, right? Give me all the variables, and I just need to get the right variables, and then I hit that target over there. And that's fine for one cannon. And if you could do that for one cannon, you can do that for about 500, you know. And imagine that you had all of those 500 lined up, and you're the one. You see, Napoleon would have been when he started off. You would have been the one, doing the calculations and or making sure that the what targets are picking which targets are going to be taken, and commanding his men to load it up and whatnot. But by the time he's at the head of armies, he's commanding, you know, hundreds of cannons. And so what Napoleon is ends up being able to do, just back to the magical point, like this, and this is unique because of the fact that like nobody could do this before. In previous eras, generals would be like, "I want you to take down that wall, use the cannon, just you do your thing." But now we have these trained, men from gunnery schools who are using all of this, precision, all of this sort of accurate physics, right? That's only come out recently, and they're able to basically call down thunder and lightning on a particular location. And so Napoleon can flatten entire cities, and has this capability to command more men than any man on the European continent has ever been able to command before. And how is he doing it? And that's the mystery around Napoleon that people are drawn in by. And fair enough, like it's a massive change that's happening at the time.
Yeah, and it's those victories that gives him the street cred, and then people want to bask in his glory and learn his secrets and how does he
Yes.
do it, right? And well, but the real magic is in the precision. It's like, well,
Yes.
how are you using these things? Oh, well, I'm deploying them this way on purpose to break the back of the enemy or the spirit of the enemy, right?
Yeah.
It's not I'm going to raise the city to the ground sort of a thing, so much as it's I'm going to scare the hell out of the people. And because that's what all war really was, right? It was
Yes.
you can yell louder, people will run away, and then you don't have a battle. But
Yeah.
that's changed because of the efficiency of killing. So yeah, to your point, the whole World War I, World War II artillery thing begins with Napoleon, all of it.
Yeah.
In the same way that trench warfare begins in the quote Revolutionary War in the United States. That was the first trench warfare, right?
Mm.
And so you don't realize those two things kind of come together later for World War One, and then this idea of efficient killing, right? That's the guillotine, right? That predates Napoleon. It's
Yeah.
just that he has an efficient killing machine or he learns how to use the precision artillery as an efficient killing machine, because efficient killing is all of a sudden a thing that you can do,
Yes.
right? And it's not seen in the same light anymore. Before, killing was this very ritualistic, important. It's important how it's conducted, right? And now it's not, and you have, to your point, like, so rifling's new. Well, in the southern US, where they won most of their battles, by the way, with England during the Revolution, they have these rifled barrels. And
Yeah.
so they're picking off officers. And before
Yeah.
that, no one ever picked off an officer. That never
No.
happened. And the problem is, because they're picking off officers and England's still power from above, once the officer's gone, no one knows what to do.
Yeah.
They can't think for themselves, so they're all done. And Napoleon starts that whole commanders think for yourselves things too.
Yeah.
Like, he begins all of that, right? He's like, you just need to make sure this objective happens, and here's your cannons. And then I'm going to go over here and manage this part. And
That's
he
right.
divides up his army in a way that hadn't been divided up. And again, a lot of this is informed by the changes as a result of the American so-called revolution, right?
Yeah.
Or the American rebellion. I like that idea better.
Yeah. Yeah. Um. Yeah. And just a last thing on that, on the organization of the army. That's right. He delegates command to his marshals, and they're characters in and of themselves because he had to trust them. Whereas before, you would have had a similar command structure, but it's for fewer people, and so you can have a sort of small core of nobility to sort of manage that. Whereas in Napoleon's army, the nobility are taking part, but you also have this sort of phenomenon of people rising from the ranks. Actually, many of Napoleon's marshals, one of them was the son of a butcher, which again,
Right.
50 years prior would have been, crazy talk.
Right, right. And that's back to Alexander,
Yeah,
right? This is more like Alexander than it is like Rome, right? Or
yeah.
than it is like Greece, because they didn't
Mm.
fight that way. It was Alexander who started that fighting, the
Oh yeah,
Macedonian, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
who pissed
I'm
off
being
all the
reminded.
Greeks.
I'm being reminded of the LARPing that Napoleon did as Rome. Yeah, that's an unfortunate part of that period as well. That's where we get, funny non-existent countries like Belgium from. If you're, curious, that's the word Belgium just comes from Julius Caesar's commentary on the Gallic Wars, where he fights one of the tribes. It's called the Belgae, and then okay, so then it's Belgium. Oh yeah, the land of the ancient Belgian people. So yeah, that the revolution spreads from Napoleon out, and that's, I would say, where you get this idea of continental philosophy. Because if you view Napoleon as basically, he marches his armies across all of Europe. He goes to Spain. He goes to and by proxy Portugal. He goes into Germany. Oh yeah, of course. He breaks up the Holy Roman Empire. Maybe we could do more on that another time. But he marches all the way to Russia, and everyone talks about Russia. But all of that time, you think, well, yeah, he's marching. His armies are following him. His men are with him, and these are revolutionary men. Many of these men owe their station solely to what occurred post 1789 or something, the start of the French Revolution, right? And so they have these strange ideas, and when they're garrisoned, they'll talk about it, and the printed materials will come with them as well. And so you have, in the wake of this, long after Napoleon, actually very soon after Napoleon's dead, you have these sort of quote unquote nationalist movements where you have, all of a sudden the Italians, right, become a sort of a people, and by 1850 you have a unified Italy. There was in 1860. 1860 you have a unified Italy under Giuseppe Garibaldi. In Spain, you have this sort of tension in the monarchy that you have these sort of, you sort of see at the other end of with the Spanish Civil War, right? Because you at that point you got sort of a republic, and they're going through their republics now, which previously, again, Spain had no truck with any of that. They just, it was a normal Western European monarchy. Germany forms out of this, let's say on a more Napoleonic sort of bent rather than the sort of early revolution, but Germany forms from those sorts of ideas. Um, yeah, so there's something to be said for what happens post the French Revolution on the European continent, and one wonders whether that is also spread to the U.S. so that there's a sort of a misapprehension about what the American part in that was, because the one thing you could sort of summarize the difference between the American and the French Revolution is, the Americans saying we are going to get our God-given rights because because it is the just and right thing to do, and we will peaceably ask for redress of grievance and then escalate from there. Whereas the French are just like, yes, yes, we want to get rid of the king too. And by the way, there is no God. That's kind of that's how they end up.
Right. So it's not even get rid of the king, it's get rid of the head.
Yes, yeah,
It
yeah,
doesn't matter which head, all the heads have to go, right?
right.
And of course, everyone's like, well, none among us want to be a head, so we'll all step back. And in rush the true revolutionaries,
Yes,
right? And then it's good to note that the French Revolution doesn't end until the people who started the killing machines going were killed by the killing machines,
yes,
which is weird. But that pattern happens again and again in history. Like, well, they're being fairly successful until they're not. And then it's like, oh,
mm,
maybe that's not a good idea. They were successful. So making people unsuccessful is a strong signal to the rest of the country, right? And then it's like, well, what are we going to do now? And then here's Napoleon.
yeah,
Oh, look at this guy who's, defended France during the revolution, right? And expanded France, expanded French influence finally, before French influence was waning, to your point, right?
yes,
And now it's not. And well, we're just going to dismantle that Holy Roman Empire thing because we weren't using it anyway. We're France,
yeah,
right? And then he declares himself emperor.
yeah,
right? Where in the past you didn't do that, and there was no emperor. Like, I mentioned this before, but we looked into this. Like, the Holy Roman Emperor had a hell of a lot of titles, like
Yeah.
a lot, and each region had their own personal relationship to that monarch, right? And then when they went there, they adopted that title, so they didn't have a simple title. And then I know you've pointed this out before, right? There's the painting of Napoleon
Yeah.
forcing the bishops to watch. So the power is ironically not coming down from above at all. The
No.
power is being taken from below, stolen. The divinity is being stolen and coerced into cooperating with making him not, emperor of France and Holy Roman Emperor of this region and that region, right? He's going in and he's changing it. He's making it precise. Where precisely is the land of the Belgae?
Yeah.
Where precisely do we put these tribes that the Romans struggled with, Caesar in particular? What do we call them? Because we need
Yeah.
names for them, right? What so but this region, I'm just emperor. Like, I'm just
Yes.
emperor of the whole. So he's flattening the world. The
Yeah.
world is very flat, right? And so you see this pattern playing out. And then, yeah, what's the role when the U.S. kind of sees this, and what's the anticipation? What's going on in the mind? But it's this misapprehension of the Enlightenment, like, oh, the Enlightenment gives us precision and accuracy and a level of understanding that we couldn't have before,
Yeah.
maybe, right? But at the same time, what's really happening is you're taking away all of the components that held things together from below,
Yes.
right? By having that emanation, you're taking away that emanation, and you're coming from below and saying, no, 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 it's all emergence. I have emerged. I, Napoleon, have
Yes.
emerged from not France, even, right? From
Yes.
Corsica to lead your glorious empire,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
there's nothing being bestowed from above, even though the
No.
Continental Philosophy is very much power from above, which is very weird. It's a weird, ironic twist in a sense.
It's like the Uberos. It's like the snake eating itself almost. It's quite
Right.
quite disturbing actually, especially for
Right.
the implications that has on the rest of history thereafter.
Yeah. And there's very much that taking power in a scientific way,
Yeah.
right? In a well-known, well-ordered, well-structured, well-controlled by me, Napoleon
Yeah.
way. Because this is how the world's going to be divided up. This is how things are going to work. This is the nature of how we rule, right? It's the beginning of the science of government, which I think is an invalid science to begin with. I don't think you can science your way to government or governance. And I think that's part of the problem, is that, we evolved the kingship and right of rule and all of that stuff for a very specific reason and purpose, right? It was very
Yeah.
hierarchical. It was divided up that way, and it worked for a very long time. It worked very well, and it wasn't unchanged or anything. But that
Yeah.
basic hierarchical structure was there. And now Napoleon comes along, and the revolution comes along and flattens the world by refusing to take the mantle of the king, in essence, and letting any old person take it, roughly speaking. And then Napoleon furthers that and says, no, 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 I'm going to be the new king. I'm just
Yeah.
going to call myself emperor, and then give you all your country sovereignties back. But not really, because your identity is just part of the Empire of France, which
Right.
is not an individual identity like the Holy Roman Emperor gave each of its sovereign states, roughly speaking.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and just to look at how that affects it even today, um, how does the French language work? Well, it's regulated by some body, right? And they decide to admit words into the French language. This is one thing that I found out. You know what they said about the Occitanian language, which is the language that was spoken by Richard the Lionheart. They called it a patois. That's it. That's a non a kind of a parochial, not even a parochial, like a not even a language, you know. And so they started exterminating all these local dialects, and that started from the French Revolution onwards to the point where very few people at all speak Occitanian nowadays. In fact, many of them, I looked it up. There was a campaign of shaming people who did. Yes,
Wow.
yes,
Wow.
and they were all told that it was a patois, that it was this just a lesser form of French, which of course French isn't French. It's the language that was spoken by the people in the vicinity of Paris.
Right. right,
And that's
in
what became
Parisian.
standard French. Yeah, it's Parisian French. There you go. Yeah,
Uniquely Parisian. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because there's that universality, that flattening of the world. This is what universality does. It makes the world flat,
yeah.
right? It's like, well, if we could just get everybody on board with this idea, it's like, yeah, but you can't. And why would you? Are you sure that's what you want to do, right? Because now we're
Mm-hmm.
we're straying into the territory of, well, what is evolution? Yeah, evolution is non-universality, roughly speaking, right? It's the denial of universality as a good way to propagate. The
Yeah,
propagation has to come through change, and so you
yeah,
can't have universality and change. They're mutually exclusive. And you can see that in the revolution, and you can see that when the revolution devolves into pure chaos, you need a hero, and a hero emerges in Napoleon.
yeah. Well, and he's almost an anti-hero with compared with somebody like Charlemagne, actually, because of how big.
Ultimately,
If you compare the two, yeah,
ultimately, right? Oh,
yeah,
they're right. They need a hero, right?
yeah,
But what they really need is not a single individual. So you can see
right,
the individualism that comes out of the misapprehension of the Enlightenment, because when you're not embedded in that framework of the church, right, of the Christian tradition, whichever Christian tradition it is, now all of a sudden you can just be out there by yourself, taking over lands, drawing lines on maps and saying, aha, and therefore declaring yourself emperor without the permission or
yeah.
or blessing of the
Consent.
church.
Yeah,
Consent, right? Permission, consent, or blessing, right? You're missing all of those. Those are all separate components, and that's the flattening of the world through the universalization of how things work, through the misunderstanding, that scientific sort of purely scientific understanding of the world without accounting for the spirit of the locals. The spirit of the locals, they want to speak a certain language, a certain dialect, right? The spirit of the locals, they're not the Belgae anymore, maybe, right? They've either integrated or been usurped or whatever, right? Why are you trying to, and you can see that, right? I mean, Belgium is a good example of, well, I'm just going to go back to Roman times and instantiate the old empire of Rome my way. And then I'm
yeah.
going to be an emperor, a Caesar, roughly speaking, right, of this region.
Very strange.
And a lot flows from that. And yet there's still this misapprehension of this power, top-down power, because now it's top-down power from any individual.
Mm, yeah,
Right. And so the will to power is there, right? It's always there, right? And somebody picks up on that, Nietzsche maybe, right? Right. Picks up on seeing that, right? Because Napoleon is the ultimate Ubermensch will to power guy in
oh
some
yeah.
sense, right?
Mm,
He's the ultimate because he does it. He creates a modern empire through the use of modern tools and modern science, right? And spreads those ideas everywhere, right? Because that's always the people always look at, well, this war didn't go well, and yeah, but they spread ideas, and those ideas sometimes take hold, and right, because it's the spirit that matters, not the material force, we'll say,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, and you see the attempt to use materiality to wipe out spirit, right? That happens all the way back in ancient Egypt, with Akhenaten and all that crew, right? They become monotheists, they get kicked out of the country. That could be the Jewish story. I don't know. The timelines are awful close on that one.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. But they try to wipe out King Tut. Why? Because he's the last in that line of monotheists, and the
Mm,
priest class don't like it. Right. And so they try to use the materiality to wipe out that idea. But of course, that idea doesn't get wiped out. It actually grows and more or less takes over most of the world now. Right. And certainly all the Western world to some
yeah,
extent is influenced by that heavily. So, and you see that continuing. The idea is an embodiment of Napoleon, because he actually pulls most of it off.
yes.
Very negative consequences for Europe in particular, right? Because that really, oh, look what Napoleon did. We can do that. That's what World War I is,
Yeah,
right? In a big way. We can just take over other countries and not worry about it. And we can use this precision killing to do it, which is a materialistic way of manipulating the world, right? Instead of the idea way, where you spread ideas, which is,
yeah,
it's ironic, right? The Enlightenment is all about spreading ideas. The Scots don't do anything. They're just up there in their miserable Scottish place, being miserable Scots, right? Coming up with brilliant ideas.
yeah, yeah. You gotta do something during the rain.
Exactly. And the relative cold and bleakness of Scotland. Yeah. Yeah, I've been there. It's lovely, beautiful place, absolutely gorgeous. But yeah, the winters are tough, man. The winters are tough. I mean, they're not really cold by my standards because I grew up in New England, but I can see where if you're not used to, if that's your coldest, then yeah, it's pretty miserable for you.
Yeah.
So what else? Do you think we're complete on the little picture here of the influence of the French Revolution and Napoleon and the misapprehension of the Enlightenment, or
I think, yeah. So to wrap up, let's get, I guess, look at the way that sort of contrasts with America. Then I don't know. It's America. If you think about in the ensuing period after Napoleon, where does America go versus where does the European continent go? Because that's probably
Hmm.
a good way to point to the difference as well. Um, because America generally, I mean, even by the time of the First World War, it doesn't really want to get involved. In fact, but for a a particular gentleman setting up a bull moose party, that is Teddy Roosevelt. America may not have went into the war. If they did, perhaps their course would have changed. But the point being is that America kind of for a long time was sort of very much, even up until that point, was separate. Was just, we're going to do our own thing over here. Um, Whereas what happens in the European continent is essentially what leads up to World War One, and you see it throughout. Like it is a consistent flattening of um, regional identities, until the point where by the end of it you have the death of the last sort of hereditary um, emperor of Austria, Charles the First. um, he is done with like the Austrian Empire, which is the successor to the Holy Roman Empire. Um, that dies out, and what happens in its place is you have these created nations. The French Revolution basically, almost attempts to finish off the basically who was the successor to Charlemagne, right? And so what do you have if you look in the old if you so it was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire by the time of World War One. But if you look at all that old territory, you see that it does not fit. People say, "Oh, it's the Balkans." Like that's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that's an empire that could not, to its very core, was contra to this idea of leveling. Um, Very much kind of it's kind of like a um, what the Americans preserve is what Austria might wanted to have become, or not Austria, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But what you have now is just sort of the predomination of civil law. So this idea that instead of being judged by your peers, by people who are your equals, you are judged by these judges who are just basically experts, you know, um, yeah, many of which are specialists, and you have this breakdown of any sort of, I suppose, intimate connection with government as such, if that's even a
Right,
thing you can have, right? But any sort of
right.
personal relationship with those around you via how everyone should organize. Whereas in the US and England as well, to a greater or lesser degree, and probably, I mean, in some smaller forms in local regions, but largely, the French Revolution did its job. Um, in America, it seems that there is still this idea of a sort of political participation, let's say, um, and an allowance for space for the personal, or even the regional.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference that one can see even today as a consequence of this idea of a proper relationship with the head as such. And I think the pre it's not only America and it's not only England. A lot of it's unfortunate, actually, I think, in retrospect, that many of the continental states, many of which were as ancient as even more so than um, some of the English institutions, were essentially effaced, or if they exist now, are very, very much reduced.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too, one of the things that causes World War One is this strict adherence to contract.
Yeah,
It's these treaties. It's like these treaties are all written up, right? And there's Woodrow Wilson, right, from
yeah,
the League of Nations, the early United Nations disaster, right, that he eventually resigns from, even though he founded it, right,
mm,
because of all the bad things that are happening as a result of these contracts. And so you can see the failure of contract law to work, like this precision governing idea, the science of government thing fails. And that's what causes World War One, is the failure of this precision governing that Napoleon put in place. And I think that's, you can argue, well, Europe was always at war. Yeah, but they were minor skirmishes between smaller countries. And
yeah,
now all of a sudden there are large affairs between, you know, uh, rival factions that
mm,
aren't that don't have the same goal. Like,
yeah,
Germany wants to play the colonization game, and they feel cheated out of that to some extent. And like, fair enough, they were cheated out of that because they didn't exist. Right? So, and yeah, where did Germany come from? I don't know. I think Napoleon had a lot to do with that, right? Like,
yeah.
that's the thing. Like, this idea that you can draw lines on a map and say, and therefore, and yeah, you're right. Belgium's a perfect example. How many languages are in that little tiny postage stamp of a place? And how are you
Yeah.
really cohering if you've got all these cultures
It's split.
merged?
It's split down the middle between the people who speak Dutch or Flemish, really, and Walloon, which is a form of a dialect of French.
Right.
That's it's
There's
split down the middle.
three languages, though, in this little region.
Oh, and German. Yeah, yeah. Actually, they still have.
Right,
Yeah, yeah,
right. It's just absolutely nuts. It's
yeah,
nuts. And how are they supposed to govern themselves? And then it turns out that when push comes to shove, they can't. And it's
yeah.
like, well, it's fine. And a lot of it is that legacy. Well, the king just takes care of us and we don't have to worry about it. And then you can't do that in Europe. Can't do what you did, in the United States. Yeah,
No.
you can't because the United States is, you're involved in your government. You're responsible for your government. Your government, because it emerges from below within this container, like within this
Yes.
Christian framework. But we're within these Christian values and virtues, we're going to make you responsible for your own governance, but you're responsible for your own governance.
Mm.
So it's a whole different attitude. And Europe just misreads that, right? And they're
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, we don't need a governing body anymore. And to some extent, a lot of the countries didn't until they did, and then they really did. But now it's too late.
Yeah.
It's too late, and they're not connected to their government. And I think, yeah, there's a way in which they're not intimate with their government, but also their government isn't intimate with them. To your earlier point,
That's right.
French nobles who weren't in the regions they were supposed to be nobility over. And what does that do when you're hanging out at Versailles? Because it's this enormous place. Versailles is enormous. Like, it's hard to get the scale. I got to get
Yeah.
over there one of these days. I'd love to see it, but it's an enormous place. It's
Yeah.
just like, they talk about the place, and I'm just like, I can't even imagine how big this place is. It's huge, and they're hanging out there all year. They're not
Yeah.
leaving. They're like, oh, who wants to leave? It's beauty all the time. It's beauty
Yeah.
all the time. Yeah.
No responsibility though.
Right. No response. Well, look, it's a good deal.
Versailles, Pleasure Island. That's what it, I guess, turned out to be.
Pleasure Island, right? And all the little Pinocchios with their long noses.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I like it. I like it. All right, what do you think, Adam? Is that a wrap on this French Revolution and this whole like different way of seeing, or what?
I think it's a good place to leave off for now because I think this is a massive topic. It really is. Like it's I hope we did it justice for the conversation. But yeah, I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe if people like it, they can comment and let us know. And also, if you want to hear more about this, because we sort of touched on it and brushed off of it real quick because it's another like 2 hours. Talk about rulership and the reason, like the real reason, what the difference between the Holy Roman Emperor is and what Napoleon did, like, because there's a difference there. And to really exemplify that, we'd have to go back into ancient Rome and all the way out and up right?
Yeah.
And they just talk about that in the European context.
Yeah.
But if you want to hear that, you'll have to comment to let us know that you want us to spend our time on that. Otherwise, who knows what will emerge next? And I think the way to use these history videos is to think of all the different perspectives that we're trying to give you and different ways of seeing the same events, right? Because that's really what this is about, is sort of understanding the different layers of analysis, right? The different contexts in which you can view what happened. Because it's not like, oh, the French Revolution invented the guillotine and therefore, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, but the guillotine all by itself, right? Because of this idea of precision, right? This all plays into this whole thing.
Right.
So yeah, yeah, that's great. Thank you, Adam. And let's plan to do it again sometime soon on the YouTubes.
Thanks for having me on.